There's something strange about the way the Cleveland Browns have been operating offensively, not in what they've said, but in what they've stopped saying, because when teams believe in their offensive identity, they reinforce it repeatedly. Publicly, predictably, the Browns haven't done that. Their language has shifted, their sequencing has shifted, even their silences have shifted. And when an organization starts quietly creating distance from its own offensive structure, it's usually not random, it's usually preparation for something they're not ready to explain yet. Offensive identity in the NFL isn't just about play calls, it's about commitment, not just on Sundays, but in tone, in messaging, in consistency. Because when a team knows exactly what it is offensively, everything aligns around that clarity. Coaches describe it confidently, players describe it simply, executives describe it carefully. But consistently and for a while, the Browns had that alignment. Their offense wasn't mysterious. It wasn't fluid. It wasn't undefined, it was structured. Controlled, intentional, not necessarily explosive, but stable, which is why the shift now feels different, not because of a specific play, not because of a specific result, but because of the absence of reinforcement. There hasn't been the same public anchoring to one offensive philosophy, no repeated verbal commitment to one direction, no urgency to clarify exactly what this offense is becoming. And that matters more than it seems, because uncertainty inside an organization rarely appears all at once. It appears gradually, first in small adjustments, then in small hesitations, then in small distances between what a team does and what it says it doesn't. Right now, the Browns exist inside that distance, not fully detached from their offensive past, but not fully reinforcing it either, which raises a quieter question. Not whether the offense is changing, but whether the organization has already decided it needs to and just hasn't said it yet. NFL organizations don't operate emotionally, they operate structurally. Every offensive system represents an investment, not just in scheme, but in personnel, in coaching, alignment, in long-term roster construction, which means abandoning an offensive direction isn't just a tactical decision, it's an admission that something foundational didn't produce what was expected. Organizations resist that admission for as long as possible, not publicly, but internally, because the moment you fully commit to a new offensive identity, you create consequences for decisions already made, and that's where behavior becomes more revealing than statements, because teams preparing for offensive shifts rarely announce them early. They create flexibility instead, flexibility in language, flexibility in structure, flexibility in how responsibilities are distributed, and flexibility allows them to observe outcomes without committing explanations to those outcomes. This is where coaching behavior becomes especially important, because offensive systems are extensions of coaching conviction, and conviction has patterns. Clear conviction produces repetition, uncertain conviction produces variation, not chaotic variation, controlled variation, the kind that allows experimentation without acknowledgement. And when you look closely at how offensive leadership operates under these conditions, you start to see something subtle, not abandonment, not replacement, but loosening, small reductions in structural rigidity, small expansions in operational possibility, not enough to trigger attention, but enough to create optionality, which suggests the Browns may not be protecting their offensive identity. They may be protecting their ability to move away from it quietly, without disruption, without declaration, without needing to explain why the original structure no longer holds the same certainty it once did, because once that certainty disappears internally, the external messaging usually follows later, not before later, and that delay exists for a reason, because change inside NFL organizations doesn't begin when it becomes visible, it begins when it becomes inevitable, and inevitability rarely announces itself. It accumulates. Offensive strategy in the NFL is never just about play design, it's about alignment between expectation and reality, expectation from ownership, expectation from coaching leadership, expectation from personnel investment, and most importantly, expectation from trajectory, not where the offense is, but where it's clearly going, because trajectory determines patience when trajectory is upward. Organizations tolerate inconsistency when trajectory becomes unclear, tolerance disappears faster than anyone admits publicly. This is where individuals become variables inside a larger equation, not as failures, not as successes, but as components whose effectiveness depends on structural alignment. Quarterbacks operate differently depending on system confidence. Coaches call differently depending on organizational patience. Players execute differently depending on systemic clarity, and when that clarity weakens, execution often becomes less predictable, not worse, just less stable, and instability forces evaluation, not emotional evaluation, structural evaluation, because offensive identity isn't protected for sentimental reasons, it's protected for functional ones. The moment it stops producing structural certainty, it becomes negotiable, not publicly, internally, which means the Browns don't need to announce offensive change for offensive change to already be underway. It only requires one condition: that the organization no longer treats its current offensive identity as permanent, because permanence shapes behavior. Temporary structures shape flexibility, and flexibility changes everything, not immediately, but inevitably, because once an offense becomes flexible, it stops anchoring decisions, it starts responding to them, which shifts control away from system certainty and towards system evaluation, and evaluation always leads somewhere. The only question is whether the Browns already know where that somewhere is, or if they're still discovering it. In real time, offensive identity in the NFL doesn't disappear suddenly, it fades gradually, first in language, then in structure, then in conviction, and eventually in permanence. The Browns haven't explained what their offense is becoming, but they may not need to, because the most important offensive shifts don't begin with announcements, they begin with distance, and right now, there's just enough distance to suggest something has already started. The only thing we don't know yet is how far they're willing to let it go.